All right, so today we're going to get into a pretty wild story. It's about how a single powerful idea could, well, kill a king, build a whole new empire, and basically define an entire century. We're talking about a story of immense power, incredible tragedy, and just radical world-changing transformation. I mean, it's a huge question, right? How on earth did one single idea, an idea that started in, libraries and factories across Europe, how did that topple a dynasty that had been around for 300 years? And not just that, but completely redraw the map of the world. It sounds impossible. So to even start to understand it, we've got to go back, way back to the beginning. So we're kicking off with a world ready for change. And believe it or not, our story doesn't actually start in Russia, which is probably where you'd expect. Nope, we're starting in 19th century Europe, which was, well, it was basically a powder keg, just packed with all these new ideas and really old problems, simmering with this feeling that something had to give. And this, right here, really gets to the heart of the problem during that time. It's this huge contradiction. On the one hand, you had the incredible promise of the French Revolution. All these amazing ideas about liberty, equality, rights for everybody. So much hope. But then, you look at the reality of the Industrial Revolution, and it was just grim. Smoky, brutal factories, poverty everywhere, and this growing feeling for most people that life wasn't getting better, it was actually getting a whole lot worse. So, who was trying to figure all this out? Well, you basically had three main groups, kind of like the main characters on the political stage. First up, you've got the liberals. They were all about gradual reform. They wanted a government run by educated people with property. Their whole vibe was, hey, let's just fix the system, not completely break it. Then you had the conservatives. They were looking backwards, to the past. They wanted to hold on to tradition, and if things had to change, they wanted it to be super slow. And finally, the radicals. They took one look at the whole system and just said, nope, it's broken. They wanted a government that actually represented the majority, and they were totally willing to tear the old world down to build something new. Okay, so you have all these different ideas clashing, but out of all that noise, a new, much more revolutionary vision started to take shape. And this is going to be the real protagonist of our story. Let's talk about this socialist dream. So what was this big new idea all about? At its core, it was pretty simple. Early socialists looked at all the poverty and the massive inequality, and they said, you know what? It all comes down to one thing: private property. Their thinking went something like this. As long as a few people own all the factories, all the land, all the stuff that makes money, well, the vast majority of people are always going to get the short end of the stick. They'll be exploited. So their solution was radical. What if we just took property out of private hands completely, and instead society as a whole controlled it for the benefit of everyone? And then this guy named Karl Marx comes along, and he takes this big philosophical idea and turns it into an actual revolutionary blueprint. See, for Marx, socialism wasn't just a nice thought or a moral choice. He saw it as a historical inevitability. Like, it wasn't a question of if, but when. He argued that capitalism was fundamentally a system built to exploit workers. And as you can see in this quote, he believed the only way out was for the workers themselves to rise up and just overthrow the whole thing. For him, a communist society wasn't some fantasy. It was the natural society of the future. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a call to arms. Okay, so we're moving on to Russia, the pressure cooker. And here's the crazy thing. You'd think an idea like this would really catch fire in a super industrial place, right? Like Britain or Germany. That's actually where Marx himself predicted the revolution would kick off. But nope. The first place this idea was really put to the test was, well, pretty much the last place you'd expect: the massive, mostly agricultural and totally autocratic Russian Empire. I mean, just take a look at the sheer scale of this empire back in 1914. It was absolutely enormous. Under Tsar Nicholas II, Russia stretched all the way from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific. It was this huge, multi-ethnic empire. And the Tsar, he ruled with absolute power. There was no parliament, no one to check him. What he said went, period. And this chart, wow, this chart tells you pretty much everything you need to know about how different Russia was. While the rest of Europe was all about building factories and cities, a staggering 85% of the Russian people were peasants. Their entire lives were tied to the land. And you can just imagine the kind of resentment that builds up when you have this tiny class of nobles who own almost all of that land you're breaking your back on. It was simmering just below the surface. But industry was starting to pop up in a few places, and that created this new working class, living in just awful conditions. I mean, just look at this. Can you imagine? You're working 15-hour days for practically nothing, and then you come home to sleep in a crowded, filthy barrack like this? This wasn't some land of opportunity. For millions, it was a total dead end. And when you're living like that, well, those radical ideas start to sound pretty good, don't they? So now we have our two acts, and you can see how this is all coming together, right? You've got this powerful new idea, you have a massive population that's angry and resentful, and you have a government that refuses to bend. It's a pressure cooker, and in 1917, it finally exploded. Not just once, but twice. So how did we get there? I mean, the road to ruin was just paved with one disaster after another. You could probably say it really started back in 1905 with Bloody Sunday. That was when the Tsar's own troops fired on peaceful protesters. The trust between the ruler and his people, gone forever. Then, fast forward to 1914, and Russia jumps into World War I. It was an absolute catastrophe. A meat grinder. We're talking over 7 million casualties. So by 1917, the army is just broken. And back home, people are literally starving in the streets, waiting for bread. The whole country was just collapsing. Okay, so the first explosion, the February Revolution, was completely spontaneous. This wasn't planned by some political party. It started with women, hungry textile workers, who just went on strike because they needed bread for their families. But then the protests just grew and grew until you get to the absolute turning point. The soldiers were ordered to fire on the crowds, and they refused. In fact, they joined them. At that moment, the government lost all control. And within days, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated. I mean, just like that. Poof! The Romanov dynasty, 300 years of rule, was gone. And in its place, a giant, gaping power vacuum. And who steps into that vacuum? Vladimir Lenin. He's the leader of this really radical group called the Bolsheviks. And he comes back from exile with this slogan that is just brilliant. It's so simple, so powerful. Peace, land, and bread. Think about it. Peace for the soldiers who were so done with the war. Land for the peasants who've been working someone else's soil forever. And bread for the workers who were starving. It was everything the people wanted, right there in 3 words. So if the first revolution in February was just pure chaos, the second one in October was the complete opposite. It was a plan. Lenin decided the time was right to seize power for the socialists. And on October 24th, his forces moved like clockwork. They took over government offices, the post office, train stations. They stormed the Winter Palace and arrested the ministers. It wasn't a massive, messy battle. It was a quick, calculated, and efficient coup. And with that, they kicked out the temporary government and created the world's very first socialist state. All right, so now we're building the new world. Because, grabbing power is one thing, but actually holding on to it and trying to build a brand new society from the absolute ashes of the old one, well, that turned out to be a whole lot harder and a whole lot more brutal. And I mean, almost right away, a vicious civil war just explodes. On one side, you had the Bolsheviks, known as the Reds, fighting to keep their new socialist society alive. And on the other side, you had the Whites, and this was basically everybody else. A messy mix of people who wanted the Tsar back, liberals, even other socialists who didn't like the Bolsheviks. And they got help from countries like Britain, France, and the US because everyone was terrified this whole socialism thing might spread. So after a long and bloody fight, the Bolsheviks win the war. And now they get to work on this massive project, industrializing the country with these things called 5-year plans. This propaganda poster just captures the new vision perfectly. It wasn't just about building factories. Factories became these heroic symbols, almost like a new religion of progress. Look at that caption. The smoke from the chimneys is the breathing of Soviet Russia. It's like the country itself is this powerful, living, breathing machine. But that was the propaganda. The reality for a lot of people was just incredibly hard. This letter from a 13-year-old kid, it's just heartbreaking. It really shows you the other side of this. He says his mom is sick, they have no food or money, and all he wants to do is study, but he has to go work in a factory so his family doesn't starve. So despite all the promises of a better life, for many people, the dream and the reality were just worlds apart. And nowhere was that gap between the dream and the grim reality more tragic than out in the countryside. Stalin brought in this policy of collectivization, which basically meant forcing millions of peasants to give up their small farms and join these huge, state-controlled ones. The peasants resisted fiercely. Some even killed their own animals rather than hand them over. And the result was absolute chaos, leading to a man-made famine of just unbelievable horror. Between 1930 and 1933, it's estimated that over 4 million people starved to death. So, when you step back and look at all this, what do you make of it? This is the idea's global echo. Because the Russian Revolution wasn't just something that happened in Russia. No way. Its impact, its echoes, rippled across the entire planet and really shaped the whole rest of the 20th century. And that brings us to the big, central question that people still argue about today. Was it a workers' paradise or a repressive nightmare? I mean, on the one hand, the Soviet Union took a pretty backward country and turned it into a global superpower, a superpower that was absolutely crucial in defeating Nazism. It inspired people fighting for independence all over the world. But, and it's a huge but, it did all of that through just incredible brutality. It created a one-party state that took away basic freedoms and was responsible for the deaths of millions of its own people. And that's the thing. In the end, the Soviet Union itself is gone, but the debate it started, that never went away. The huge questions it dragged out into the open, questions about equality, about property, about freedom, about how much power a government should have, well, we are still fiercely debating all of those things today, in our politics, in our economics, everywhere. And maybe that is the revolution's most powerful, most enduring legacy.